Hey guys, tonight we drift into the rugged heart of Calabria, where mountains stretch like broken teeth against the sky and shadows cling longer than the daylight hours. Our story begins not with a throne or a title, but with the rough edges of a boyhood shaped in Taurianova, a small town pressed hard against the Aspromonte hills. Picture narrow lanes where laundry hangs between windows, goats wander the dust, and every whisper carries more weight than a shouted word. It is here that Ernesto Fazzalari takes his first breaths, long before anyone dares call him a ghost. Childhood can be tender, but in Calabria it often doubles as training for survival. And for a boy like Ernesto, survival means listening more than speaking, watching more than acting, and carrying silence as if it were gold. You probably won't survive this world if you walk into it with soft steps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing from where in the world you're tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Fazzalari household rests in the folds of Taurianova, an area where generations lean on one another. Ernesto's childhood unfolds in the 1950s and 60s, decades when the region remains poor yet proud, a place where olive groves stretch into the horizon, and family dinners carry more rules than the classrooms. His father works with calloused hands. His mother tends to the children with a patience forged by hardship. They do not speak of power openly, but in this land, silence says more than sound. A child learns quickly that respect is a currency heavier than coins. The streets are alive with fragments of history. Older men gather in the piazza, retelling stories of vendettas past, their eyes darting as though the ghosts of those tales still circle the square. Ernesto absorbs it all, the tones of grief, the pride in revenge, the uneasy peace that holds only until the next insult ignites. The Aspromonte hills loom above, dark green by day and black by night, a fortress and a warning. They are both protector and prison, and Ernesto senses early that the mountains keep secrets better than men do. By the time he is 10, his curiosity pulls him toward alleys where older boys practice the art of disappearing. They duck around corners, vanish through doors, learn which elders to greet and which to avoid. It is not a child's game, though Ernesto might pretend it is. It is rehearsal for a stage he has not yet seen. The elders watch him, noting the quiet way he follows without being told, how he memorizes routes others forget. A boy who remembers paths is a boy who might one day need them. Mainstream history gives us a reminder here. In these years, Calabria suffers not only poverty, but the ripple effects of Italian unification and post-war neglect. Infrastructure lags behind, schools lack resources, and opportunities seem scarce compared to northern Italy. Emigration swells as men head to Germany or Switzerland to find work, but not every boy leaves. Those who remain adapt to what the land offers and what the land hides. For Ernesto, adaptation means balancing the innocence of youth with the unspoken awareness of darker undercurrents. He plays soccer in dirt lots with friends, but the ball often rolls past half-demolished houses, buildings abandoned not by time, but by feuds. Many people still think that this environment alone creates men like him, shaped as much by absence as by presence. So what do you think? Can a child born here ever truly walk a straight path? Or are the crooked lanes too persuasive? At family gatherings, Ernesto listens more than he laughs. His cousins boast of small triumphs, a fistfight won, a favor earned from an uncle. Ernesto stores the stories quietly, his eyes flicking toward the adults. The men sip wine slowly, pausing long between sentences, as if even the air might betray them. When disputes arise, they never raise voices. Instead, they lean closer, eyes narrowing, their words sharp but low. Ernesto learns that real anger never shouts. Information closest to character comes from those who later recalled his childhood. Neighbors said he was never the loudest boy, never the troublemaker. He blended, which in Calabria is a skill sharper than any knife. He knew when to appear helpful, when to vanish from a conversation, and when to stare at the ground as though the stones held secrets only he could read. Even as a child, Ernesto seemed to fade into background, and yet, people noticed his absence more than his presence. Walking home from school, he passes shrines at crossroads, small boxes with fading candles, photos of young men who never reached 25. Each shrine is a story half told, a reminder that a wrong look or a misplaced word can cut life short. Ernesto lingers near one, his hand brushing the wood, his eyes lingering not on the picture, but on the silence around it. Perhaps he wonders why these men are remembered with flowers, but not spoken of aloud. The humor of childhood still finds a way in. A goat once chased him down the road, forcing him to leap into a ditch while his friends laughed until tears rolled. Ernesto climbed out, muddy, expressionless, as though the whole scene had been scripted for someone else's amusement. Later, when teased about it, he simply replied, "Better to be muddy than hungry," a line that earned him nods from elders who valued practicality over pride. As the years pass, Ernesto's awareness sharpens. He notices which men carry themselves with untouchable calm, which families others avoid angering, and how sometimes a glance exchanged at Sunday Mass carries more weight than the priest's sermon. He observes, absorbs, and files away. The boy who once only followed soccer balls into alleys now studies the alleys themselves, mapping exits and entrances as though preparing for something larger. The mountains remain his backdrop, patient and eternal. By 12, he knows their slopes like the back of his hand, running with friends through goat trails, climbing to caves that overlook the town. From those heights, he can see the sprawl of olive groves, the clustered houses, the roads leading out like veins. Perhaps it is up there he first tastes the idea of vanishing into the land itself, letting the hills become part of him. Through Ernesto's eyes, childhood is not only survival, but preparation. Tarianova provides him with everything he will one day need: the silence, the loyalty, the coded gestures, the geography, and the awareness that strength lies not in being seen, but in being remembered only as rumor. And so, the boy who begins life as just another child in a small Calabrian town edges slowly, quietly, into becoming a ghost in training. Family ties in Calabria run deeper than any law written on paper. For Ernesto Fazzalari, those ties stretch across Tarianova like invisible wires, binding him to people, places, and silences he can never quite escape. His childhood slides into adolescence with the certainty that family is both armor and anchor. In southern Italy, to belong is safety, and to be without kin is to drift unguarded in a sea of suspicion. The Fazzalari family is not particularly famous, not wealthy, not celebrated for noble deeds, but they are respected in the way that matters most in Calabria. People nod when they pass, No one pries too closely into their affairs, and whispers about them never linger long in the air. Ernesto watches as his parents move through the town with quiet dignity. His father greets neighbors with restrained warmth, never gushing, never boasting, always measured. His mother holds the family together with a discipline born of scarcity. Meals stretched from little, clothes patched until they could patch no more. The lesson is constant. Appearances may falter, but the family must endure. Mainstream historical fact slips in here. Calabria, throughout the 1960s and 70s, remains one of Italy's poorest regions. Unemployment is high, public projects often stall, and the government's presence feels remote, more rumor than reality. In such conditions, family networks matter more than civic institutions. For many, the state is an abstraction, while the family is survival. Ernesto grows up in this atmosphere of tight bonds and unspoken rules. At Sunday lunches, relatives fill long tables, laughter mingling with the clink of cutlery. Yet beneath the joy runs an undercurrent of tension. Conversations shift when strangers approach. Voices lower when certain topics arise. As a boy, Ernesto learns to sense the subtle change in tone, the coded looks, the sudden silence. He does not need explanations. The lesson is clear. Loyalty means knowing when not to ask. One relative, an older cousin, becomes a figure Ernesto admires. This cousin, broad-shouldered and stern-eyed, is said to have connections with men of influence, though no one names them outright. Ernesto notices how others treat him with deference, how neighbors step aside on the street, how even the local priest greets him with formality rather than familiarity. The cousin never boasts, never threatens, yet his presence commands attention. Ernesto studies him closely, learning that real authority often speaks through silence, through the absence of fear in one's gait. Information closest to character comes from the recollections of those who knew him young. Ernesto was a boy who never betrayed family confidences, not even to friends he trusted. He absorbed the code of omerta, the law of silence, long before he ever heard the word pronounced. Teachers remarked he was diligent but distant, a boy who did his work but rarely revealed much of himself. At home, he was dutiful, quick to fetch water, careful never to shame his parents with disobedience in public. The humor of these years comes from the everyday absurdities of village life. Once, during a family pig slaughter, Ernesto was tasked with holding the animal steady. The pig squealed so loudly that neighbors swore it sounded like a priest giving a sermon. Ernesto's grip slipped, the pig bolted, and half the family chased it through olive groves until nightfall. When they finally caught it, panting and covered in mud, Ernesto simply shrugged and muttered, "At least it had one last adventure." The line stuck, repeated at gatherings for years, always followed by laughter. Even in stories of mistakes, his wit left a trace. Family is not merely blood, it is also the extended network of godparents, distant cousins and neighbors, whose loyalty can be counted upon in times of trouble. Ernesto learns to map this web instinctively. He knows which baker will offer credit when money is thin, which farmer will share a portion of figs, which uncle will turn a blind eye when boys sneak cigarettes behind a shed. Every bond has its weight, every favor its cost, every silence its value. Many people still think that the 'Ndrangheta's power rests on guns and fear alone, but those who lived in Calabria know otherwise. Power here begins with family, who you can trust to shield you, who will defend you in court, who will hide you in the mountains if the day ever comes. So what do you think? Could Ernesto have avoided the path he eventually walked? Or was he already hemmed in by ties too tight to break? By adolescence, Ernesto has internalized the lessons of loyalty so thoroughly that he does not even question them. If a cousin asks him to deliver a message, he does it without hesitation. If his father instructs him to help mend a wall for an uncle, he works until his hands blister. If his mother warns him to hold his tongue about something he overheard, he holds it so firmly that not even his closest friends suspect. These small acts of loyalty shape him more profoundly than any formal initiation ever will. And so, as Tarianova's dusty streets echo with the chatter of children and the laughter of families, Ernesto grows into a young man whose world is already drawn in invisible lines. He belongs to a web that stretches beyond his house, binding him to a tradition centuries old. The ghost of Aspromonte is not yet a ghost. He is still a boy, but one already learning that family ties in Calabria are not threads you can cut. They are chains you wear proudly until they drag you where you never intended to go. First brushes with Ndrangheta rituals arrive for Ernesto, like shadows seeping under a closed door. He doesn't ask for them, and no one formally announces them. Yet slowly he feels their weight pressing in. In Calabria, a boy of his age inevitably crosses into spaces where the sacred and the dangerous mix. The Ndrangheta doesn't recruit children with fanfare. It watches them, tests them, and waits until they learn obedience before ever whispering the word family in its darker sense. It begins innocently enough. Ernesto is asked to run errands for older men. Sometimes it's delivering a folded note. Other times it's carrying a small package wrapped in cloth. He never peeks, never asks. The discipline of silence, already ingrained in him, makes him the perfect courier. His small tasks earn him quiet nods from men who matter, nods that mean far more than coins in his pocket. Historical fact sharpens this picture. The Ndrangheta is not a gang in the casual sense, but one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates in the world, structured around blood ties and secret rituals. By the 1970s, its clans control not only local extortion and smuggling, but also international connections, particularly in the heroin trade. Calabria is its cradle, and villages like Tarianova are its nurseries. One evening, Ernesto is brought into a dimly lit cellar beneath a relative's home. The men sit in a circle, their faces half hidden by smoke curling from cigarettes. He is told to stand in the center. There is no ceremony with trumpets, no applause. A single candle burns on a table next to an icon of a saint, San Michele, the archangel who holds a sword. Ernesto's hand is pricked with a needle, a drop of blood staining a small image of the saint. The paper is set aflame, curling into ash, while words are spoken, oaths of silence, loyalty, and obedience. He listens intently, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the flame until it dies. He is not yet a full member, but he has stepped across the threshold. Information closest to character. Later accounts suggest Ernesto absorbed these rituals with unusual calm. Other boys trembled, some even wept quietly. Ernesto stood still, his expression unreadable. It was not bravado, nor was it indifference. It was as though he had expected this moment all along. He left the room as silent as he had entered, offering no comment, carrying the weight of secrecy as naturally as he carried his own shadow. The humor of the night arrives not in the ritual, but after it. Walking home, one of the older men mutters about the candle wax spilling on his shoes. Ernesto, still processing what just happened, replies dryly, "At least it wasn't blood." The man chuckles, shaking his head. The remark spreads among them, a reminder that even in solemnity, this boy's tongue has a sharp edge when he dares to use it. Many people still think that such rituals are relics, dramatic flourishes exaggerated by films and journalists. But those who have stood in those smoky basements, or who have heard whispers in the piazzas of Taurianova, know the truth. The oaths are real, and the weight of them lasts a lifetime. So what do you think? Are rituals like these the binding force of power, or merely theater meant to test obedience? From that night onward, Ernesto moves differently. He doesn't strut, but his steps are heavier with purpose. He begins to attend gatherings not as a child tagging along, but as a presence noticed. Older men test him with small responsibilities, guarding a car, standing watch at an alley, or listening at a meeting without speaking. Each task is less about action and more about endurance. They want to see if he breaks under pressure, if boredom makes him sloppy, if fear makes him careless. He never falters. Historical fact again. Omerta, the code of silence, is not merely cultural, but ritualized. A member's life depends on never speaking to authorities, never betraying secrets, and never prioritizing personal comfort over clan loyalty. Breaking this code historically meant death, not only for the betrayer, but often for his family. Ernesto grows into this truth as naturally as he grows into his own height. The Aspromonte hills become both training ground and temple. Men take him into the woods, teaching him how to read the land, which caves can hide a man, which trails vanish into gullies, which clearings offer a view of approaching enemies. The mountains, already part of his childhood, now become part of his apprenticeship. They are no longer just hills to climb for fun. They are the fortress where rituals gain their teeth. In these moments, Ernesto becomes less a boy and more a figure taking shape, a shadow forming against the backdrop of Calabria. He carries the memory of that flame curling his blood-stained saint into ash, a memory that flickers every time he is called to serve, every time silence demands more from him than words ever could. The Aspromonte mountains rise behind Taurianova like a jagged wall, always looming, always silent. For Ernesto Fazzalari, they are more than a backdrop. They are a living presence, shaping his sense of space, safety, and secrecy. To most townsfolk, the mountains are rugged terrain best avoided at night, filled with wolf howls and sudden storms. To Ernesto, they are a fortress, a labyrinth, and eventually, a home. As his teenage years deepen, he learns to move across the Aspromonte with the instinct of someone who belongs to the rock and the soil. Friends complain about the endless climbs, the stinging cold at higher altitudes, the fog that rolls in like a thief. Ernesto, however, adapts quickly. He memorizes goat trails invisible to outsiders, notes where the streams run strongest after rain, and learns which caves can shelter a dozen men without leaving a trace. Historical fact reminds us that the Aspromonte is not just wilderness. During the Second World War, its slopes sheltered partisans who resisted fascist forces, and later, the terrain became a stronghold for fugitives of all stripes. Law enforcement dreaded it. The 'Ndrangheta revered it. By the 1970s, journalists called it Italy's Bermuda Triangle, a place where men vanished into thin air, only to reappear years later at weddings or funerals. Information closest to character comes from accounts of locals. Ernesto was said to vanish into the hills for days as a young man, sometimes with only a loaf of bread and a knife, returning leaner and quieter than before. No one questioned where he went. His mother claimed he was tending goats, but neighbors knew better. The mountains were training him in patience, silence, and invisibility. They would later call him a ghost, but the mountains made him one first. At night, sitting under chestnut trees with older companions, he listens to stories of vendettas fought decades earlier. The men point to ridges and valleys, naming places where ambushes happened, where blood was spilled, where feuds etched themselves into stone. Ernesto absorbs every detail, not with excitement, but with the steady calm of someone writing maps in his mind. He begins to understand the hills as others understand books. Each path a sentence, each cave a paragraph, each ridge a chapter in a long history of shadows. Humor sometimes intrudes even in such serious landscapes. Once, while camping with friends in the hills, a sudden storm drenched them. Ernesto tried to build a fire, but the wood was too wet. When the smoke fizzled out, one boy groaned. "Even ghosts need dry matches." Ernesto, without looking up, replied, "Ghosts don't need warmth, only silence." The group laughed, and the nickname stuck longer than anyone expected. The mountains also become a shield against authority. Police patrols sweep Tarianova from time to time, checking for contraband, questioning men who loiter too long. But whenever danger rises, someone whispers to Ernesto, and within minutes he is gone, swallowed by Aspromonte trails. Even as a youth, he seems to disappear faster than others. By the time officers reach his street, there is nothing left but an open door and the echo of his absence. Many people still think that police incompetence alone explains why men like him evaded capture for so long. But step into these mountains once, and you'll see otherwise. Fog can erase a trail in minutes. Rain can turn a clear path into a muddy river, and the dense chestnut forests swallow sound. So what do you think? Could anyone really chase a ghost through such a maze without becoming lost themselves? Historical fact again. Kidnappings during the 1970s and 80s often used Aspromonte caves as holding sites. Hostages, both foreign and Italian, were chained underground for weeks or months while negotiations dragged on. The police sometimes discovered caves years later, littered with scraps of clothing, rusty chains, and burned-out candles. These were not legends. They were grim proof that the mountains served as both dungeon and throne. For Ernesto, the hills become an extension of his identity. He knows which stones are loose, which streams taste pure, which gullies echo footsteps too loudly. He trains himself not just to move through them, but to vanish into them, until even friends joke that the mountain itself has adopted him. By the time he is 20, he walks the Aspromonte not like a visitor, but like a native spirit, one with the terrain. Others sweat and stumble. He glides, calm and assured. The fortress has chosen him, and in return, he offers it loyalty. From now on, whenever he needs safety, the Aspromonte will answer. It will keep him hidden, just as it has hidden countless men before him. And so, the ghost begins to learn where he will haunt. A taste of smuggling profits arrives like a sharp scent of tobacco drifting through the dusty lanes of Tarianova. Ernesto, still in his youth, discovers how money travels faster than words, and how contraband finds its way through every crack in Calabria's stone. Cigarettes, fuel, and sometimes even small arms, these are the commodities of his early education. They are easier to hide than drugs, less bloody than vendettas, and far more lucrative than honest work in the fields. Historical fact adds clarity. In the 1970s and 80s, contraband cigarettes were one of southern Italy's most reliable black market trades. Smugglers ferried cartons across the Mediterranean, landing them in ports like Gioia Tauro before filtering them inland. From there, the goods spread like wildfire through the villages, enriching families who could bypass taxes and outpace state inspectors. Young men carried crates on mule trails at night, while elders orchestrated the exchanges from behind shutters. For Ernesto, the trade begins small. A friend's uncle hands him a bundle wrapped in cloth and tells him to deliver it across town. Inside are cigarette packs, brands foreign to the local market. Ernesto walks calmly, not rushing, not sneaking. He knows better than to look guilty. When he hands over the bundle, he receives a coin or two in thanks. The amount is trivial, but the principle is not. He has joined the current. Information closest to character comes from stories repeated later. Ernesto showed little excitement over the money itself. While others boasted of what they'd buy, shoes, jackets, perhaps a watch, he pocketed the coins quietly. When teased about his lack of indulgence, he replied, "Money talks too loudly if you spend it too quickly." That attitude set him apart. Even as a boy in smuggling circles, he acted like someone saving his words for when they mattered. The profits grow. Soon he is helping unload trucks under moonlight, gasoline drums disguised beneath tarps. Cigarettes move in bulk, filling warehouses that appear empty by day. Ernesto becomes part of this machine, not as a loud operator, but as a silent cog who notices everything. He counts boxes without being asked, remembers faces without forgetting, and knows which alleyways to avoid when police patrols cut through town. The humor of smuggling often comes from the absurdity of hiding the obvious. Once, Ernesto and a companion were tasked with transporting several cartons by donkey. The animal, perhaps feeling mischievous, refused to move. It planted its hooves and brayed so loudly that dogs barked across the valley. Ernesto, stone-faced, muttered, "Even the donkey knows it's contraband." The men laughed, but the cartons arrived on time. Ernesto simply walked beside the animal all night, patient as stone, until it resumed its path at dawn. Many people still think that smuggling was merely about greed, quick profits, and thrill-seeking youths. But for Calabria, it was survival in an economy where honest labor paid pennies and the state seemed absent. So what do you think? Was Ernesto's entry into smuggling truly a choice, or the only open door in a town where every other path led to hunger? The profits allow him to glimpse another world. He sees men arrive in polished cars, their suits crisp, their watches heavy. They come to collect shares, to oversee deals, to nod in approval when the operations run smoothly. Ernesto studies them, not with envy, but with calculation. He notices which man gives orders, but never lifts a finger, which man smiles only when money changes hands, which man is always last to leave, but first to know. He begins to understand hierarchy, not as theory, but as a map of power traced in smoke and coin. Historical fact again. Gioia Tauro port, not far from Ernesto's world, later became one of the busiest hubs for international drug trafficking. But before cocaine shipments dominated, contraband cigarettes and fuel established the infrastructure of corruption and secrecy that allowed larger trades to flourish. Smuggling was the rehearsal. Narcotics would be the main act. Ernesto does not yet know the scale of what is coming. For now, he pockets his modest profits, returns home with muddy boots, and eats supper with his family as though nothing happened. His silence is his shield, his patience, his strategy. He is not dazzled by wealth, not tempted by flashy spending. Instead, he treats smuggling like an apprenticeship in discipline, a way to test himself, to prove he can carry secrets heavier than crates. In the Aspromonte hills, where trails echo with footsteps of centuries past, Ernesto learns that profit is never only about money. It is about trust, about proving reliability, about becoming a man others can depend on when silence is worth more than silver. Cigarettes may burn away in smoke, fuel may vanish in engines, but the reputation a young man builds in those trades lingers long after the goods are gone. And so, with each crate he carries, each coin he pockets, each secret he keeps, Ernesto Fazzalari steps further into the current of an underworld that will one day call him its ghost. Mentor figures emerge in every life, and in Calabria they often arrive with a shadow behind them. For Ernesto Fazzalari, still young and moving through the smuggling networks, guidance comes not from teachers in classrooms, but from the older men of the local clans. They are the ones who correct his posture, shape his silence, and refine his instincts. In this world, a mentor is not someone who gives you advice with a pat on the back. He is someone who tests you, measures you, and watches whether you flinch under pressure. One of the first to notice Ernesto's potential is an uncle by marriage, a man whose hands look like they belong to a farmer, but whose eyes betray the weight of authority. He takes Ernesto on long walks through olive groves, explaining little in words, but much in pauses. A glance at a ruined farmhouse signals history. A nod at a neighbor signals allegiance. Silence after a name signals danger. Ernesto learns that what is left unsaid often matters most. Historical fact sets the scene. The Ndrangheta clans of Calabria in the 1980s were consolidating their structures, creating locale organizations, local cells that mirrored each other in ritual and hierarchy. Elders acted as keepers of both tradition and power. They carried themselves as farmers or shopkeepers in public, but behind closed doors they held court over decisions that could ripple through entire regions. For a young man like Ernesto, proximity to such figures was both education and elevation, information closest to character surfaces in later accounts. Ernesto was not brash in the presence of his mentors. While other youths might have boasted or rushed to prove themselves, he stayed quiet, absorbing detail. Elders remarked that he had the patience of someone far older than his years, a quality that distinguished him from hot-headed peers. He learned to wait for moments rather than chase them. These mentors shape his approach to strategy. One man shows him how to negotiate without ever appearing to bargain, how to make silence so heavy that the other side folds first. Another teaches him the value of reputation. A single act of reliability can outweigh months of promises. Ernesto takes these lessons not as commandments, but as tools, sharpening them in his mind for later use. There are moments of humor, too, even in lessons shadowed by crime. Once, while Ernesto accompanied an elder during a clandestine meeting, the man whispered, "Watch carefully, boy. The trick is to look bored while you're making history." Ernesto replied softly, "Then you must have made a lot already." The elder chuckled, and though the meeting continued in silence, he later admitted the boy's wit gave him hope. Many people still think that organized crime is sustained only by violence and intimidation. But the truth lies in mentorship, in passing down codes, rituals, and habits as carefully as a family recipe. So what do you think? Would Ernesto have risen without the steady hand of mentors shaping his path? Or was he already destined to find his way alone? Historical fact again. Calabria in these years saw the first sparks of the great clan wars, vendettas that left dozens dead in Tarianova and beyond. Young men without guidance often fell quickly, either to bullets or to prison sentences. Those under mentorship, however, survived longer, learned to anticipate shifts, and built networks that endured. Ernesto belongs to this second group, men tutored in patience rather than bravado. As years pass, Ernesto becomes a favored apprentice. Mentors trust him with more sensitive errands, more complex tasks. He carries not only goods, but also messages that decide the timing of trades, the movement of money, the survival of allies. Each mission cements his reputation as dependable, discreet, and increasingly capable of handling responsibility far beyond his age. For Ernesto, these mentors are more than figures of authority. They are mirrors of what he might become. Calm, respected, feared in ways that do not require loud threats. He learns to emulate their stillness, to adopt their pace, to carry himself as though time bends around him. The ghost he will later become is being shaped here by men who see in him not just a boy, but a future keeper of the shadows. First acts of violence mark the threshold between apprenticeship and belonging. For Ernesto Fazzalari, they do not arrive with the spectacle of cinema. They come quietly, almost inevitably, like footsteps following him through the alleys of Tarianova. Violence in Calabria is not random. It is coded, measured, and often demanded as proof of loyalty. For Ernesto, the time comes when errands and smuggling no longer suffice. The men who guide him know that silence and patience must be tested against fire. It begins with a dispute. Two families quarrel over territory, each claiming rights to extortion from a new business sprouting on the edge of town. The whispers grow louder, the meetings sharper, and soon the matter requires muscle. Ernesto, still in his 20s, is told to stand watch one night as others deliver a warning. He waits at a corner, heart steady, eyes scanning the shadows. He doesn't need to swing a fist. His job is to make sure no one interrupts. When the scuffle ends, he walks away without glancing back. Those who see him afterward notice something unsettling. He is calm, neither proud nor shaken. He carries violence like one might carry a stone, heavy but ordinary. Historical fact sharpens the background. Tarianova and its surrounding towns were flashpoints for vendettas throughout the 1980s. Clan rivalries escalated into bloodshed, culminating in the infamous Tarianova massacre of 1991. Younger affiliates like Ernesto were expected to participate in smaller conflicts before the storm broke, both to prove loyalty and to harden their nerves. Information closest to character comes from accounts whispered later. Ernesto's first personal act of violence was not loud, not bloody in the open streets. It was a confrontation in a dim alley where a rival youth had been mocking his clan. Ernesto cornered him, spoke no words, and struck hard enough that the boy never mocked again. The rival survived, but his silence afterward carried more weight than bruises. It was Ernesto's way of saying, "I can act when required, but I do not need to boast." The humor of violence, if such a word can be used, sometimes emerges in how men recall it afterward. One elder told of Ernesto's expressionless face during that first scuffle. "He looked bored, as though swatting flies," the elder said. Another added, "If death came to visit, Ernesto would probably offer it coffee before flinching." These remarks, spoken with half a grin, underscore the aura he carried, unshaken, unflappable, a ghost in training. Many people still think that initiation into organized crime comes with dramatic blood rituals and cinematic murders, but more often it begins with small, brutal necessities: a punch in the dark, a gun fired into the air, a car vandalized to send a message. So what do you think? Is true loyalty proven in grand gestures, or in these quiet acts that no one applauds but everyone remembers? Historical fact again. The Italian state, during these years, struggled to maintain control over Calabria. Police forces were underfunded, investigations stalled, and local communities often refused to cooperate out of fear. In this vacuum, violence became both justice and law. A boy like Ernesto didn't need to be told twice. He saw the pattern, and he knew what silence demanded. Each act of violence, however small, pulled him deeper. He learned not only how to strike, but when not to. Violence in his world was not reckless, it was strategic. He saw men die young because they confused anger for authority. Ernesto chose the opposite. He acted when ordered, never more, never less, and carried no need to brag afterward. This discipline became part of his myth. By the end of his 20s, Ernesto was no longer just a courier or a smuggler. He was a man who had proven his loyalty not only in silence, but in action. His reputation began to stretch beyond Torianova, whispered in towns nearby. A boy who vanished into mountains, who carried errands with precision, who struck when told, but never left a trail of noise. The first acts of violence did not make him a monster. They made him part of a machinery older than himself, older than the town, older even than the state. And though he never spoke of them, they carved into him the calm, unshakable presence that would later earn him the title of Ghost. Quiet rise through local ranks does not happen with fireworks. For Ernesto Fazzalari, it is a process as slow as olive trees growing in the Calabrian sun. From boyhood errands and shadowed rituals, he moves into a space where his name begins to carry weight, not through noise, but through the stillness he leaves behind. Men begin to mention him in conversations not as a helper, but as someone to be respected, someone whose silence can be trusted more than another's oath. In the 'Ndrangheta, rank is not pinned to uniforms but sewn into the fabric of everyday life. Ernesto becomes one of those figures whose presence at a meeting changes the tone of the room. He listens more than he speaks, observes more than he reacts, and when he does act, he does so with precision. His elders notice. They see a young man who can be relied upon to keep order, to carry messages, to hold secrets, and, most importantly, to refrain from recklessness. Historical fact. By the late 1980s, the 'Ndrangheta was evolving beyond its village roots, expanding into drug trafficking networks that stretched to South America and Northern Europe. To survive in this expanding empire, clans required not only men of violence, but also men of calculation. Strategy became as valuable as bullets. Ernesto's demeanor fit perfectly into this shift. He was not a showman with a pistol. He was a tactician with patience. Information closest to character comes from those who later recalled his role in this period. Ernesto was said to be the man who could be counted on to arrange meetings without attracting notice, to smooth quarrels before they erupted, and to calculate logistics so that operations ran like clockwork. One former associate described him simply, "He was the man who made sure nothing went wrong." Yet even a man rising in silence collects moments of humor. At one gathering, a heated argument broke out between two older men over how to divide earnings from a smuggling run. Voices rose, fists slammed tables, Ernesto, sitting quietly at the corner, leaned in and said softly, "If the money makes so much noise, maybe we should give it to the church." The room burst into laughter, the tension broken. Both men glared at him, then grudgingly smiled. The dispute ended, at least for the night. Many people still think that power in the mafia comes from shouting orders, brandishing weapons, or spilling blood. But often, true influence comes from the man who prevents fights, who smooths tempers, who ensures the gears keep turning. So what do you think? Is the quiet strategist more dangerous than the loud enforcer? As Ernesto steps into this new role, he also gains exposure to wealth. He sees the villas of bosses hidden in the countryside, the cars polished until they reflect the sun like mirrors, the expensive suits worn to weddings that make peasants whisper. Yet he does not imitate this extravagance. He dresses plainly, moves modestly, and spends sparingly. It is not humility so much as strategy. To be invisible in Calabria is safer than to shine. Historical fact again. During this time, Italian investigators began noticing the 'Ndrangheta's unusual stability compared to other mafias. While Sicily's Cosa Nostra exploded into bloody wars, Calabria's clans expanded quietly, investing in construction, agriculture, and shipping. Their resilience lay in their ability to remain under the radar, projecting an image of rural tradition while handling millions. Ernesto mirrored this balance perfectly. Plain in appearance, dangerous in reality. Through these years, his rise is steady. No scandals, no reckless stunts, no betrayals. Just a trail of tasks completed, conflicts resolved, and silence kept. In the hierarchy of the shadows, such consistency is priceless. Elders begin to trust him with more than errands. They trust him with judgment. When disputes arise, his word starts to matter. When decisions must be made, his voice is considered. By the time the 1990s approach, Ernesto Fazzalari has become more than a boy from Tarianova. He is a figure of reliability, a quiet regent in training, a man whose absence feels heavier than another's presence. His rise through the ranks is not marked by loud victories, but by the steady accumulation of trust. And in Calabria, trust is currency more enduring than gold. The 1991 Tarianova massacre explodes like a thunderclap across Calabria, and Ernesto Fazzalari finds himself standing at the edges of one of the bloodiest chapters in 'Ndrangheta history. For years, tensions have simmered between rival clans in Tarianova, each seeking dominance over extortion, construction contracts, and the flows of contraband through Gioia Tauro. In the summer of 1991, the simmering finally boils over. Historical fact: the massacre leaves at least 8 dead in just a few days, their bodies scattered in streets and alleyways, bullets carving warnings into the town itself. It becomes a turning point, drawing national attention to a war that most outsiders had barely noticed. For the locals, however, it is less an eruption than the inevitable conclusion of insults and rivalries stretching back decades. For Ernesto, this is not the moment of loud heroics. He is not photographed wielding weapons, nor named in police reports as a gunman. His role is quieter, but no less significant. Information closest to character suggests he was involved in planning movements, making sure safe houses were stocked, ensuring allies had escape routes through the hills. He did not chase blood for its own sake. He calculated survival. The massacre changes Tarianova overnight. Windows shutter, shops close early, and families avoid the piazza after dusk. Children whisper the names of the dead as though reciting ghost stories. priests deliver homilies about peace that no one believes will hold. The streets, once filled with daily life, now echo with silence and fear. In such an environment, Ernesto's calm demeanor stands out. While others panic or posture, he remains steady, a figure who seems to anticipate the storm rather than react to it. The humor of these grim days is black, but even then, it exists. One villager recalls how, during the gunfire, a stray dog darted through the street carrying half a loaf of bread in its mouth. Men ducked for cover, children screamed, but Ernesto, watching from a doorway, simply muttered, "Even the dogs know when to loot." The line, delivered without a smile, spread among his circle as proof of his ability to see absurdity, even in chaos. Many people still think that mafia wars are won by whoever kills the most enemies. But in reality, wars are survived by those who manage logistics, maintain loyalty, and keep their heads down until the smoke clears. So what do you think? Was Ernesto more dangerous for the bullets he didn't fire than for those he did? Historical fact again. The Italian state responded to the Torianova massacre with increased police presence, new investigations, and promises of reform. Yet the cycle of vendetta did not end. Arrests were made, trials dragged on, but the structure of the 'Ndrangheta proved resilient. Clan leaders went underground, fugitives melted into the Aspromonte hills, and business quietly resumed. For Ernesto, the massacre serves as both crucible and catalyst. He emerges not with headlines, but with credibility. Those who fought know he was reliable, calm under pressure, and capable of organizing survival amidst bloodshed. Those who survived know his word could be trusted when panic reigned. In a world where violence consumed many, Ernesto's restraint and precision make him invaluable. By the end of 1991, Torianova is scarred, but Ernesto's reputation has only grown. He is now more than a loyal apprentice or quiet strategist. He is a man seen as essential, a figure whose judgment could mean the difference between survival and ruin. And though the massacre leaves the town haunted, it also sets the stage for Ernesto to step deeper into the shadows, preparing for the years when he will no longer just serve the clan, but embody its ghostly resilience. Hiding in mountain caves becomes second nature to Ernesto Fazzalari in the years following the Torianova massacre. For many in Calabria, the idea of retreating into the Aspromonte hills is a desperate act, a last resort when the police close in or when rival clans hunt too closely. For Ernesto, it is almost a return home. The mountains that shaped his childhood now swallow him whole, concealing him from both law enforcement and enemies alike. Historical fact: the Aspromonte has long served as a sanctuary for fugitives. Shepherds, bandits, and partisans once used its rugged terrain as refuge. By the late 20th century, the 'Ndrangheta adopted it as a fortress. Police helicopters struggled to navigate its dense forests, while ground patrols risked ambushes in narrow valleys. Hostages kidnapped for ransom were often hidden in mountain huts and caves. In many ways, the Aspromonte was the perfect ally for a man who already knew how to move like a shadow. Information closest to character emerges from accounts of those who claim to have spotted him during these years. Ernesto was said to vanish for weeks, even months at a time. Shepherds recalled seeing smoke rise from distant ridges, only to find no one when they climbed toward it. Hunters claimed they glimpsed a figure slipping silently between trees, never close enough to identify, always gone by the time they reached the spot. Ernesto lived among the caves, moving from one to another, leaving behind only ashes and footprints erased by rain. The routine of fugitive life hardened him. Nights were spent wrapped in blankets damp with mountain mist. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, cured meat, sometimes wild herbs or mushrooms gathered in silence. He learned to light fires so small they gave heat but little smoke. Water came from streams, his shelter from caves that echoed with the drip of rain. To most, this would be exile. To Ernesto, it was training for the life of a ghost. Even in this solitude, humor found its way in. A shepherd once recalled lending Ernesto a worn-out coat during a chance encounter in the hills. "It will keep you warm," the shepherd said. Ernesto pulled it on, the sleeves too short, and remarked dryly, "If the police see me in this, they'll arrest you for bad taste before they catch me." The shepherd laughed nervously, and Ernesto vanished again into the fog. Many people still think that fugitives like Ernesto survived purely on fear and intimidation, but the truth is more practical. They survived because villagers, shepherds, and even reluctant sympathizers provided food, shelter, or silence. So what do you think? Was Ernesto's invisibility a product of his own cunning, or of a community too bound by fear or loyalty to betray him? Historical fact again. During the 1990s, Italy intensified its crackdown on organized crime, inspired by the anti-mafia efforts in Sicily after the assassinations of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Arrests rose, sentences lengthened, and fugitives became prime targets. Yet Calabria remained a land where fugitives could linger for years. Ernesto was among them, already shaping the legend that he was untouchable in the Aspromonte. Life in the caves also deepened his myth. Children in Tarianova whispered that he could walk unseen through fog, that bullets could not find him, that the mountains themselves protected him. Adults repeated these tales with less conviction, but more fear. Every unexplained noise in the hills became a sign of his presence. His absence in town was more powerful than his presence would have been. For Ernesto, hiding was not cowardice. It was strategy. The caves were not prisons, but vantage points, allowing him to wait, to watch, to survive until the tide shifted. And every day he remained uncaptured, his reputation grew stronger. By the end of these years, he was no longer just Ernesto Fazzalari. He was becoming the ghost of the Aspromonte, a man whose name traveled faster than footsteps, whose silence spoke louder than gunfire. Building a feared reputation is never about a single act. It is about the accumulation of whispers, each one heavier than the last. For Ernesto Fazzalari, the years following his life in the caves transform him from a young affiliate into something larger than a man, into a figure people describe with lowered voices, into the kind of presence that changes the air in a room, even when he is not there. By the mid-1990s, his name circulates beyond Tarianova. Rival clans know him as someone who keeps operations running despite the chaos of vendettas. Associates describe him as reliable to the point of unnerving because he never seeks the spotlight, never raises his voice, never leaves unnecessary traces. Police files begin to fatten with his name, though they lack evidence precise enough to pin him down. Each absence from town becomes a story. Each reappearance fuels the idea that he is not merely hiding but mastering invisibility. Historical fact anchors this moment. Italian law enforcement during the 1990s was flooded with mafia investigations. The focus remained on Sicily after Falcone and Borsellino were killed, but Calabria steadily climbed the list of priorities. Still, resources were thin. For every raid that cornered a Sicilian boss, a Calabrian fugitive slipped deeper into Aspromonte's forests. Ernesto became one of those specters, Known, discussed, hunted, but never captured. Information closest to character. Men who dealt with him said he was unnervingly calm, even when circumstances grew tense. One smuggler recalled a night when police stopped them at a checkpoint. Ernesto, seated in the back of the car, simply lowered his eyes, appearing so ordinary that the officers waved them through without a second glance. He made himself invisible, the smuggler said years later. Even when he was right in front of you, humor found its way into his reputation too, though always tinged with fear. Once, after a rival suggested aloud that Ernesto was a ghost only because he never fought, another man quipped, "Careful, ghosts don't fight, they haunt." The remark spread through taverns and markets, and suddenly people were saying Ernesto didn't need to brandish weapons. His haunting presence was enough. Many people still think that fear is built through brutality alone. But reputation is often stronger when built on restraint, on the mystery of what a man could do, rather than the evidence of what he has done. So what do you think? Is it the act itself that frightens, or the silence that leaves imaginations free to invent worse? Historical fact again. In 1995, Italian authorities officially listed Ernesto among the country's most dangerous fugitives. His name appeared on national broadcasts, alongside figures linked to international drug trafficking. For Calabria, this announcement only deepened his aura. In towns like Torianova, people shook their heads and muttered, "He has already gone into the mountains. You'll never catch him." By now, Ernesto's reputation functions as armor. Rivals hesitate to provoke him, uncertain of the full reach of his allies. Associates remain loyal, convinced that betraying him would be equivalent to vanishing into thin air themselves. Even those who dislike him admit his efficiency. The police, for their part, begin to describe him not only as a criminal, but as a phantom of the hills, someone who embodies Calabria's most difficult paradox, visible to everyone, catchable by no one. And so, the reputation builds, not through declarations, not through fireworks, but through absence, whispers, and the steady, unnerving calm of a man who has learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing you can do is nothing at all. By the time the decade closes, Ernesto Fazzalari is no longer just another clan figure. He is the ghost taking shape, one story at a time. Business and kidnapping trade becomes the next shadow Ernesto Fazzalari steps into. And in Calabria of the 1980s and 1990s, kidnapping is as much an industry as agriculture. Families in northern Italy tremble at the thought of their wealthy children taken, and newspapers fill with headlines about ransom demands delivered from the mountains. The Aspromonte hills, which Ernesto already knows like the lines of his own hand, become both prison and bank vault, historical fact. From the 1970s through the early 1990s, the 'Ndrangheta controlled one of Europe's most lucrative kidnapping rings. Wealthy businessmen, heirs, and sometimes foreign tourists were seized and hidden in mountain caves. Ransom negotiations could last months, even years, with millions of lire exchanged for freedom. Some victims never returned, their stories ending in silence. The trade financed expansion into narcotics and construction projects, fueling the mafia's evolution from local extortionists into global players. Ernesto does not lead these kidnappings, but his skills make him indispensable. Information closest to character. Witnesses later whispered that he oversaw logistics, choosing routes, hiding places, and timing of movements. He ensured that food supplies reached mountain camps unnoticed, that guards rotated without drawing suspicion, and that ransom notes traveled safely from hills to cities. If the ghost had a specialty. It was in making the impossible appear seamless. One victim, rescued years later, described life in the caves: a mattress of straw, meals of bread and cheese, and guards who rarely spoke. The victim claimed he once overheard a voice, calm and measured, giving instructions outside the cave. "That one was different," he said. "He spoke like the mountains were listening." Though the victim never saw the speaker's face, rumors in Tarianova insisted it was Ernesto. The absurdity of ransom tales sometimes birthed humor, even in tragedy. One villager recounted how guards, running out of candles for a hostage's cave, used sausages dipped in oil to create makeshift lamps. When told later, Ernesto supposedly shook his head and murmured, "At least they ate well after the rescue." Whether true or not, the remark reinforced his image as a man who treated even kidnappings with a cold, practical wit. Many people still think that kidnappings were simple acts of greed, crude snatch-and-grab affairs. But in reality, they required infrastructure, discipline, and silence across entire communities. So what do you think? Were these crimes sustained by a few daring men, or by a whole web of complicity that stretched from shepherds to bankers? Historical fact again. Gioia Tauro Port, already humming with smuggling, became a channel through which ransom money could be laundered into legitimate businesses. Construction companies, trucking firms, and even farms in Calabria were funded in part by the fear of families hundreds of miles away. For Ernesto, involvement in kidnappings deepened his legend. He was never the one pulling a victim into a van, but his unseen hand guided the process. The mountains shielded him, the silence of villagers protected him, and the terror of wealthy families paid for the growth of his world. Each successful ransom made him more valuable, each whisper of his presence in the hills more haunting. By the mid-1990s, he had become a man whose name alone invoked dread. Victims' families prayed never to hear of him directly, while associates clung to his reputation as insurance of success. Kidnapping profits not only financed the clan's ambitions, but also solidified Ernesto's role as the ghost, who orchestrated shadows without ever needing to step fully into the light. Alliances across Calabria form the web that sustains Ernesto Fazzalari's survival and rise. In a land where every hill seems to host its own clan, alliances matter more than brute strength. A man with a gun can hold a street. A man with allies can hold a province. Ernesto, by the mid-1990s, begins weaving his quiet influence into ties that stretch beyond Torianova, binding him to families across Calabria's jagged map. Historical fact grounds this: the 'Ndrangheta is not a single centralized body, but a federation of clans, each rooted in bloodlines and geography. They meet through the cupola or provincial commission, where disputes are mediated and territories divided. Unlike Cosa Nostra's more visible wars in Sicily, the Calabrians often preferred consensus, negotiation, and long-term alliances. Violence remained an option, but only when diplomacy failed. Ernesto's role in this tapestry is subtle. Information closest to character suggests he excelled at moving between factions without drawing suspicion, building quiet bridges. When one clan from Reggio sought partnership in smuggling, Ernesto facilitated the contact. When another family from Gioia Tauro fretted over vendettas spilling into their territory, he arranged discreet assurances. Associates remembered him as a man who never took sides too loudly, yet always left both parties believing he leaned slightly in their favor. His reputation as the ghost helped these alliances. Rivals feared him enough not to cross him carelessly. Allies trusted him enough to share resources. In clandestine gatherings, Men sat at long wooden tables, passing wine and counting cash, and Ernesto was often the one who remained silent until the end. When he finally spoke, his few words carried the weight of consensus. Silence had become his currency, and he spent it sparingly. Humor sometimes punctuated these gatherings. One story tells of an argument between two bosses about which family deserved a larger cut of drug profits. The men shouted, fists pounding the table, glasses shattering. Ernesto leaned back, sipping his wine slowly. When asked his opinion, he replied, "I only care who pays for the broken glass." Laughter spread, tempers cooled, and the meeting ended with a toast rather than a fist fight. Many people still think that mafia alliances are built purely on fear, forced marriages of convenience. But in Calabria, bonds often mimicked family ties, sealed with weddings, baptisms, and godfather appointments. So what do you think? Were these alliances fragile deals for survival, or genuine bonds built on shared trust across generations? Historical fact again. Investigations in the 1990s revealed how Calabrian clans coordinated not only locally, but internationally. Connections stretched from Germany to Canada, with Calabrian emigrants acting as extensions of their home families. Ernesto's world was no longer confined to olive groves and mountain caves. It was threaded into a global network. For Ernesto, these alliances mean protection. When police hunt him in Tarianova, allies in nearby villages provide shelter. When rivals plot his downfall, allies intervene quietly, ensuring peace holds long enough for business to continue. His name circulates not just as a fugitive, but as a mediator, someone who embodies both the patience of a strategist and the menace of a ghost. By the time the century nears its end, Ernesto Fazzalari is more than a local figure. He is a node in the Calabrian web, a man whose silence echoes in boardrooms of shadowy meetings, whose presence smooths vendettas before they erupt, whose alliances span valleys and seas alike. The ghost of the Aspromonte is no longer hiding only in caves. He is drifting through the very fabric of Calabria's criminal order. The 1990s crackdown comes like a slow but relentless tide. After the assassinations of anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in Sicily in 1992, the Italian state begins turning its gaze more firmly southward. Calabria, long seen as rural and remote, suddenly registers on Rome's radar. Police patrols increase, prosecutors dig deeper, and politicians call for sweeping reforms. For the 'Ndrangheta, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. Those who survive the pressure become harder to dislodge than ever. Historical fact: in 1991, Italy passed special anti-mafia legislation, creating new tools for investigators. Seized assets could be redistributed to the state, trials were streamlined, and harsher prison regimes were introduced. By the mid-1990s, prosecutors had begun applying these tools not only to Sicily's Cosa Nostra, but to Calabria's clans. Large-scale trials, some involving dozens of defendants, attempted to untangle the webs of loyalty and silence. For Ernesto Fazzalari, the crackdown is personal. His name appears in police files with increasing frequency. He is tied to kidnappings, extortion rackets, and drug routes, though evidence is often circumstantial. Information closest to character, men who knew him during this era, said he adapted by becoming even less visible. He reduced meetings, avoided gatherings, and relied on couriers instead of face-to-face conversations. Where others risked capture through arrogance, Ernesto doubled down on invisibility. In Torianova, raids become part of daily life. Police storm houses at dawn, overturning mattresses, searching for hidden weapons. Helicopters roar above olive groves, their blades scattering dust across the town. Yet Ernesto remains absent. Each failed raid adds to his legend. Locals mutter that the ghost always knows when the police are coming, as though the mountains themselves warn him. The humor of these tense years sometimes surfaces in the villagers' gallows wit. One farmer, watching yet another police caravan thunder through the streets, joked aloud, "They should just put Ernesto on the payroll. He's giving them more exercise than the gym." The laughter that followed was nervous, but it carried truth. Ernesto's elusiveness turned every operation into theater. With the police as unwilling performers, many people still think that the state's crackdown spelled the end of Calabrian fugitives. But the opposite happened. The pressure drove them deeper underground, forcing them to adapt and refine their methods. So what do you think? Did the crackdown make Ernesto weaker, or did it harden him into the very ghost the police could never catch? Historical fact again, prosecutors in Reggio Calabria during the 1990s openly acknowledged their frustration. Despite informants, surveillance, and mass arrests, key figures like Ernesto continued to evade capture. Their fugitive status lasted years, even decades, while trials dragged on without them. The result was a justice system that looked determined on paper, but powerless in practice. For Ernesto, the crackdown becomes a crucible. He learns to communicate through layers of intermediaries, to move at night only, to shift hideouts every few days. He becomes a master of the small details, how to avoid leaving footprints on damp soil, how to extinguish a cigarette so no glow betrays him, how to read the sound of distant engines before headlights appear. These habits turn him from a fugitive into a myth. By the late 1990s, as the state pours resources into Calabria, Ernesto Fazzalari's profile rises on Italy's most wanted list. His photo circulates in newspapers, though most villagers laugh that it looks outdated, incapable of capturing his real face. Children grow up hearing his name not as a man, but as a legend, a warning told at bedtime. The ghost is still out there, and no one can find him. In truth, Ernesto thrives under the crackdown. While others fall to arrests or betrayals, he survives. His ability to outweight the state, to outlast police patrols, and to remain unseen cements his place not just as a fugitive, but as a symbol of Calabria's untouchable shadows. Becoming an official fugitive is less an event than a declaration written on Ernesto Fazzalari's skin. By the end of the 1990s, Italian courts have issued enough warrants, indictments, and sentences in absentia that his status is sealed. He is no longer a man avoiding police. He is a man hunted as one of Italy's most wanted. From this point forward, every step he takes is within the rhythm of flight. Historical fact: in 1996, Ernesto was sentenced to life imprisonment in absentia for multiple murders connected to the Tarianova War, alongside charges of kidnapping and drug trafficking. This placed him firmly on the official fugitive list, aligning him with the most dangerous men in Italy. His name appeared on Interpol notices, and his face was broadcast on national television. To the Italian state, he was no longer a shadow in the mountains. He was a ghost that had to be captured. Information closest to character underscores how Ernesto accepted this shift. Unlike others who panicked when their names appeared on lists, he seemed to absorb it with calm. Those close to him said he never showed fear, never rushed his decisions. Instead, he adjusted, blending deeper into the Aspromonte. For him, being labeled a fugitive was not a sentence. but a confirmation of the life he had already chosen. His fugitive existence grew into a pattern. Days spent in caves or shepherds' huts, nights spent moving along goat trails or slipping into safe houses. Supporters provided food and shelter, often at great personal risk. The ghost was fed by loyalty, fear, and the code of silence that kept communities quiet. Villagers who suspected his presence in the hills would lower their voices, neither confirming nor denying, for to speak too much was to invite danger. The humor of fugitive life sometimes carried a bitter edge. One tale recounts how police once raided a farmhouse, certain Ernesto was inside. They turned over every mattress, searched every corner, but found nothing. As they left, the farmer quipped, "If he was here, he would have hidden in my wife's patience, because that's the only bottomless pit I know." Ernesto, hearing the story later, is said to have chuckled softly, remarking, "Even ghosts know when to stay invisible." Many people still think that fugitives live in constant panic, always running, always sweating at the sound of footsteps. But in Calabria, the fugitive often becomes part of the landscape, sustained by silence, protected by terrain. So, what do you think? Was Ernesto's fugitive life a punishment, or a throne carved out of the hills themselves? Historical fact again. By the early 2000s, Italy had intensified its anti-mafia operations using wiretaps, drones, and informants. Yet Ernesto eluded capture year after year. While bosses in Sicily were dragged into court, the ghost of Aspromonte remained untouched. Journalists began to call him one of the last untouchables, a man whose legend grew with every failed operation. For Ernesto, fugitive life became his identity. He no longer belonged to the everyday rhythms of Torianova, no longer joined weddings or funerals, no longer walked openly in piazzas. Instead, he belonged to the silence of mountains, to the whispers of villagers, to the myths told in bars. Each year he remained free. His power grew, not because he expanded his empire, but because he embodied the one truth every mafia clan respected. Survival is the purest form of victory. And so, Ernesto Fazzalari became not just a fugitive, but a ghost written into the hills, a man who lived beyond the reach of law, beyond the patience of prosecutors, beyond the memory of ordinary time, a ghost in plain sight. That was how people in Torianova began to describe Ernesto Fazzalari in the early 2000s. He was officially one of Italy's most wanted fugitives, yet rumors placed him not only in caves and shepherd huts, but also in the very streets of the town he had fled. Stories circulated of him slipping into a church for Mass, sitting quietly in the back, and vanishing before the final hymn. Others swore they saw him at night markets, hood pulled low, blending with the farmers selling olives and cheese. The paradox became part of his legend. He was everywhere and nowhere, visible yet untouchable. Historical fact. Fugitives of the 'Ndrangheta often relied on local networks of silence. Unlike Sicily's Cosa Nostra, which sometimes exiled its bosses to distant hideouts, Calabria's fugitives often stayed astonishingly close to home. Police surveillance reports revealed that many high-ranking members were found living within a few kilometers of their birthplaces, protected by webs of loyalty and fear. Information closest to character suggests Ernesto mastered this paradox. Associates later testified that he would move through Torianova at night, visiting trusted families, sharing meals in kitchens where curtains stayed drawn. He changed clothes constantly, wore simple farmer's jackets, and often carried tools to appear like a laborer. One villager said, "He could walk past you in broad daylight, and you would think he was on his way to prune olive trees. His invisibility was not only in the mountains, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. The humor of this strange existence sometimes bordered on surreal. A local barber once joked that Ernesto probably had better hair than anyone else in town, because while police were combing the hills for him, he was probably slipping into shops at night for a trim. The joke carried an edge of fear, but also admiration for the audacity of a man who lived as both fugitive and neighbor. Many people still think that fugitives like Ernesto spent all their time in exile, cut off from the rhythms of their communities. But reality shows otherwise. Many remained tethered to their towns, slipping through alleys, attending family events in secrecy, living double lives. So what do you think? Does being a ghost mean living apart from the world, or haunting it quietly from within? Historical fact. Again, police investigations during these years uncovered hideouts astonishingly close to towns, underground bunkers beneath barns, trapdoors in kitchens, tunnels connecting houses to olive groves. One raid in Calabria revealed a fully furnished hideout with televisions, books, and even a PlayStation console. The fugitives were not hermits, they were hidden citizens. For Ernesto, this double life deepened his myth. Children whispered that he could change faces like a magician. Adults muttered that he could appear in town one moment and vanish into the hills the next. Each rumor exaggerated him further, until he became less a man than a folk figure. The ghost of Aspromonte, capable of slipping through walls of stone and silence alike. And yet, beneath the myth, there was method. Ernesto cultivated invisibility not by disappearing, but by blending. He learned the art of walking so plainly that no one remembered him. He moved like wind through olive branches, always present, never grasped. In doing so, he ensured that his fugitive life was not only about hiding, it was about haunting, about reminding both the law and his rivals that he remained untouchable because he lived right under their noses. Rumors of secret lovers trail Ernesto Fazzalari like perfume through the dusty lanes of Tarianova. For all his discipline, all his cold calculations, whispers insist that even the ghost of Aspromonte was not immune to desire. In Calabria, where family honor is guarded with as much vigilance as clan loyalty, such rumors are dangerous currency. Yet they circulate anyway, carried on the lips of villagers who claim to know which shutters opened at midnight and which footsteps echoed in the alleys long after curfew. Historical fact: many long-term fugitives of the Ndrangheta maintained relationships while in hiding. Some fathered children, some married through proxy rituals, others relied on secret liaisons sustained by loyalty and silence. Police investigations often uncovered hidden apartments or farmhouses maintained by women who shielded their partners, sometimes for years. Women, often underestimated by law enforcement, became critical to sustaining fugitives' lives. Information closest to character. Reports suggest Ernesto did not live in total isolation during his fugitive years. Though difficult to verify, investigators believed he had one or two trusted women who provided shelter, food, and companionship. These women were never publicly identified, protected by silence as much as by fear. But locals whispered of lights flickering in certain homes, of laundry lines with men's clothes where no man was officially present, of women seen buying twice as much food as usual. The whispers gave the ghost a softer edge in the imagination of villagers. Children feared him, men respected him, but women sometimes spoke of him with an odd mix of dread and sympathy. One old neighbor recalled, "They said he came in the night, ate quickly, and left before dawn. Like a storm that touches the roof but does not linger, humor found its way into the gossip too. In one cafe, a man joked that Ernesto must have been the most polite fugitive in Italy. He never got caught because he always left before breakfast. The laughter was nervous, but the joke spread, becoming part of his myth. Even in whispers of romance, his elusiveness remained the central theme. Many people still think that fugitives lived like monks, denying themselves all human connections to stay hidden. But history shows otherwise. Love, companionship, and loyalty often anchored them, giving them both risk and refuge. So what do you think? Was Ernesto's survival strengthened by such secret bonds, or endangered by them? Historical fact again. Police surveillance in other Calabrian towns often discovered fugitives by tracing women, wives, lovers, or sisters who delivered food and messages. Yet, in Ernesto's case, this tactic failed for years. Either his women were exceptionally discreet, or the ghost himself managed the encounter so carefully that they left no trace. For Ernesto, these rumors of secret lovers fed his paradoxical image. He was a fugitive who seemed untouchable, yet human enough to seek warmth in the silence of night. To some, this made him more dangerous, proof that he could live in plain sight, weaving normal life into fugitive existence. To others, it made him strangely tragic, a man cursed to love in shadows, never free to linger. And so, the ghost of Aspromonte carried with him not only the fear of enemies and the frustration of police, but also the whispers of women who might have known him more intimately than any prosecutor or rival ever could. The silence of his enemies becomes one of Ernesto Fazzalari's greatest weapons. In a world built on vendetta, one would expect rivals to shout accusations, to denounce him, to draw attention to his whereabouts. Yet time and again, his name falls into a hush whenever enemies are asked. Fear acts as the gag, and silence becomes the tribute paid to his reputation. Historical fact. Calabria's vendettas traditionally left trails of public blood. Families carried feuds across generations, and revenge killings often unfolded in broad daylight. Yet during the 1990s and 2000s, some clans shifted strategy. Instead of challenging rivals openly, they practiced strategic silence, avoiding words that could spark another cycle of blood. Law enforcement noted how communities would rather erase memory than risk inviting Ernesto's attention. Information closest to character paints the picture sharply. Those who opposed him rarely spoke his name. Associates said rivals feared mentioning him even in private, convinced that walls themselves might carry sound. One story tells of a man who, asked by police if he knew Ernesto's location, simply stared at the floor and muttered, "Ghosts don't leave footprints." The response was not bravado, but resignation, a surrender to the myth that silence was safer than speech. This silence was not only about fear of death, it was also about respect for his discipline. Unlike hot-headed mafiosi who bragged or courted attention, Ernesto had built his identity around calm invisibility. Even enemies recognized the danger of a man who never overreached, never drew notice, never left behind evidence that could be exploited. Silence became both shield and crown. Yet, even in silence, humor sometimes leaked through. A shopkeeper once said, when asked if Ernesto still roamed the hills, "If he came in for bread, I wouldn't hear the door." The line, delivered with a wry smile, spread through Tarianova as a half-joke, half-warning. People laughed, but the laughter quickly faded into uneasy quiet. Many people still think that enemies fuel legends by speaking too much, boasting, accusing, or exaggerating. But sometimes, legends grow stronger through silence when even foes choose not to utter a name. So, what do you think? Is the absence of accusation more frightening than open threats? Historical fact again. Prosecutors lamented how hard it was to build cases in Calabria compared to Sicily. In Sicily, pentiti, informants, emerged after bloody mafia wars, providing testimony that dismantled parts of Cosa Nostra. In Calabria, silence reigned. Few dared to betray, fewer dared to speak. The code of omertà was stronger, reinforced by fear of reprisals in tight-knit mountain communities. Ernesto benefited directly from this culture, his ghostly presence magnified by the refusal of anyone to speak against him. For Ernesto, the silence of enemies was not a coincidence. It was cultivated. He acted precisely enough that mistakes never gave rivals easy openings. He punished betrayal quietly, in ways that spread stories but not evidence. He allowed myths to grow around him, ensuring that his enemy's silence became not only a reaction, but a habit, and so, his legend solidified. A ghost who walked unseen, a man whose enemies feared his shadow more than his blade, a figure whose silence was mirrored by the silence imposed on others. The quiet of Calabria was filled with his presence, a hush that told the world. Some names are better left unspoken. Expansion into drug routes is the point where Ernesto Fazzalari's ghost-like reputation becomes tethered to global currents of power. Cigarette smuggling and kidnappings had built the infrastructure, but cocaine changed the scale. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the 'Ndrangheta was no longer just a regional mafia. It was becoming one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the world, controlling a significant portion of Europe's cocaine trade. Ernesto, silent and careful, positioned himself within this tide. Historical fact: Colombian cartels, weakened by the deaths of Pablo Escobar and other Medellin figures, began shifting their networks toward Europe. Unlike Sicily's Cosa Nostra, the Calabrians offered stability, tight blood ties, minimal betrayals, and access to the Gioia Tauro port. This port, less than an hour's drive from Torrenova, became a key entry point for container ships carrying tons of cocaine. The 'Ndrangheta clans turned Calabria into a European hub for narcotics, information closest to character. Investigators believed Ernesto played a logistical role in this expansion. He was not the flamboyant negotiator traveling to South America, but the coordinator who ensured shipments moved safely once they touched Italian soil. Associates later suggested he managed local distribution, deciding which trucks carried what, which warehouses hid which cargo, and which families received their shares. His strength was in making the invisible visible only to those who needed to know. Humor flickered even in these high-stakes trades. One smuggler recalled unloading crates disguised as frozen fish. As they pried open the boxes, Ernesto reportedly remarked, "At least dinner is included." The men laughed nervously, but the joke underscored his ability to treat massive risk with unnerving calm. Many people still think that drug empires are built on spectacular violence, with cartels flaunting their dominance through firepower. But Calabria's empire grew through quiet efficiency, through discipline and trust. So what do you think? Is it more terrifying when power arrives with explosions, or when it seeps silently through ports and warehouses, unnoticed until it owns everything? Historical fact again. By the early 2000s, Europol identified the 'Ndrangheta as the single most powerful drug trafficking organization in Europe. Their revenues stretched into billions of euros, with investments in hotels, restaurants, and construction across Italy, Germany, Canada, and Australia. The ghost of Aspromonte, hidden in his hills, was part of this machinery, proof that one did not need to sit in a boardroom to pull the strings of an empire. For Ernesto, drug routes meant not only money, but endurance. The profits financed his fugitive lifestyle, ensured loyalty among allies, and extended his influence far beyond Torianova. Each shipment that arrived safely reinforced his value. Each euro laundered through local businesses strengthened the web of silence around him. His reputation grew accordingly. Rivals whispered that Ernesto controlled streams of cocaine that ran as quietly as mountain rivers, invisible yet unstoppable. Police, frustrated at every turn, saw his name in files connected to seizures, but could never place him at the scene. His invisibility became part of the drug routes themselves, an unseen guardian ensuring the flows continued. By the time the 2000s deepened, Ernesto Fazzalari was no longer just a fugitive hiding in caves. He was a silent node in a global network, a ghost moving cocaine through ports and valleys, a man whose absence carried as much weight as another's presence. The ghost of Aspromonte was not fading. He was expanding across oceans, across continents, across the bloodstream of Europe itself. The Calabrian vendettas returned like storms in the 2000s, reigniting memories of the Torianova massacre from the previous decade. Blood has a long memory in Calabria, and for Ernesto Fazzalari, the ghosts of old grudges circle constantly. Even as he remains a fugitive, even as his name becomes tied to global cocaine routes, the weight of local vendettas never disappears. The past demands payment, and in Calabria, debts are collected in whispers or in bullets. Historical fact: Calabria's vendettas are among the most enduring in Europe. Feuds often span generations, with killings in the 1920s avenged in the 1980s, and slights from one wedding resurfacing at another funeral. The 'Ndrangheta has always balanced its international ambitions with deeply rooted local rivalries, ensuring that even billion-euro drug empires can be destabilized by a single insult between cousins. Information closest to character shows Ernesto carefully navigating these feuds. He was not the man to spray bullets in piazzas or to call for reckless vengeance. Instead, he calculated when to intervene and when to remain silent. Associates later said that when blood debts arose, Ernesto was the one who asked, "Does killing him make us richer or poorer?" That simple question often reframed discussions. Sometimes the blade was sheathed, sometimes it was not. But the decision always passed through the ghost's calm filter. Villagers, however, saw vendetta differently. For them, every gunshot in the night, every funeral procession that grew too long, was another reminder that no feud ever really died. They whispered that Ernesto haunted the balance, his silence keeping some alive, his words sealing the fate of others. His ghostly presence in vendettas gave him the aura of a judge no one elected, but everyone obeyed. Humor, black as ever, threaded even through revenge. After a particularly tense season of feuds, one man muttered in the piazza, "We should hire Ernesto as the mayor. At least then the killings would follow a schedule." Nervous laughter followed, because in the joke was truth. His influence shaped vendettas like the weather shapes crops. Many people still think that vendettas are relics of the 19th century, outdated grudges fading in modern Italy. But the early 2000s proved otherwise. Calabria still bled from ancient wounds. So what do you think? Does the persistence of vendetta show loyalty to tradition, or a curse that keeps Calabria forever circling the same shadows? Historical fact again. Court records from the early 2000s reveal how prosecutors attempted to dismantle vendetta cycles by charging entire clans under anti-mafia laws. Yet, even as trials unfolded, new killings reignited old rivalries. Law enforcement often felt like it was sweeping water from a leaking roof. For Ernesto, vendettas were both a danger and a tool. They could destroy networks if allowed to spiral, but they could also cement alliances if managed carefully. His ghost-like reputation gave him leverage. His neutrality was respected. His decisions feared. He became a man whose silence could delay bloodshed, whose approval could unleash it. By mid-decade, the vendettas of Calabria were as fierce as ever, and Ernesto's name was etched into their fabric, not as a loud participant, but as the silent arbiter, the ghost whose shadow loomed over every feud. By the 2000s, the manhunt intensifies. Ernesto Fazzalari is no longer just a fugitive hidden in Calabria's hills. He is a symbol for Italian law enforcement, a challenge they cannot ignore. His name sits high on Italy's most wanted list, alongside notorious mafia bosses from Sicily and Campania. Posters with his face, grainy, outdated, hang in police stations across the South. Every raid that fails to capture him adds another layer to his legend. Historical fact: the Italian government created special anti-mafia units, known as the Direzione Investigativa Antimafia, DIA, and the Carabinieri's ROS, Special Operations Group. These units were tasked with hunting figures like Fazzalari, using surveillance, informants, and coordinated raids. Yet despite their resources, Calabria's terrain and silence thwarted them. Fugitives often lived just kilometers from their hometowns, hidden in bunkers or mountain huts, supplied by loyal villagers. Information closest to character. Investigators believed Ernesto's ability to remain free came from his discipline. Unlike other fugitives who risked exposure through lavish spending or arrogance, Ernesto lived with monk-like restraint. He limited visits, avoided phones, and trusted only a handful of couriers. A police report once noted, Fazzalari behaves less like a gangster and more like a ghost, present everywhere, caught nowhere. The absurd humor of the manhunt sometimes spilled into the newspapers. Headlines joked that Calabria's police should switch from boots to hiking gear, given how often they combed the Aspromonte without result. In Torrianova, villagers whispered, "If Ernesto wants to be caught, he'll let them catch him." Until then, they're only chasing fog. Many people still think that fugitives survive by constant motion, never sleeping in the same place twice. But in Calabria, the secret was often the opposite: staying still, staying close, and blending so completely that searchers looked past them. So what do you think? Did Ernesto remain free because of the mountains, or because he had already become part of the town itself? Historical fact again. In 2004, authorities captured several of Ernesto's associates, hoping pressure would corner him. They uncovered hideouts with trapdoors, underground bunkers, and even kitchens that concealed passageways to fields. Yet Ernesto slipped through, vanishing just hours before raids. His survival made headlines, frustrating police and delighting locals who relished the story of a ghost who always escaped. The longer the manhunt dragged on, the stronger Ernesto's myth became. Children grew up hearing his name on the evening news, yet never seeing him in person. Adults debated whether he was still alive, or whether the ghost had become more story than flesh. Prosecutors fumed, but villagers shrugged, as though the mountains had swallowed him whole and refused to give him back. For Ernesto, each year of freedom was another victory. He did not need to win wars or flaunt wealth. His power came from survival itself. The Italian state declared him an enemy. The mountains declared him untouchable. And in the gap between those truths, Ernesto Fazzalari thrived, still unseen, still unbroken, still the ghost of Aspromonte. Technology closes in as the 2000s roll forward, shifting the balance of the hunt. For years, the ghost of Aspromonte has relied on caves, shepherd huts, and loyal villagers. But now, the police bring new weapons, wiretaps, drones, GPS trackers hidden in cars, and thermal imaging from helicopters. The mountains, once his fortress, are slowly being pierced by invisible eyes. Historical fact. Italy in the 2000s began deploying advanced surveillance against the mafia. Thousands of phone lines were tapped each year, with conversations recorded and cataloged. Hidden cameras were installed near suspected hideouts. Drones were tested in Calabria's rugged valleys, capable of scanning for heat signatures at night. It was a new era in law enforcement, one where silence alone was no longer protection. Information closest to character. Prosecutors believed Ernesto adapted by abandoning modern conveniences altogether. He avoided phones entirely, refused to use cars without trusted drivers, and relied on handwritten notes or face-to-face meetings. Villagers said he sometimes traveled on foot for miles to deliver a single message. His ability to resist technology was, in its way, another form of invisibility. He became an old-world fugitive surviving in a digital age. Still, the pressure grew. Police intercepted conversations between associates, coded words about shipments, movements, and meetings. Each tape pulled the noose tighter. Investigators admitted they never caught Ernesto's voice directly, but they caught echoes of his decisions. He was a ghost on tape, shaping events without leaving sound behind. Humor surfaced even in this technological chess match. One officer, after a failed raid guided by drone surveillance, muttered to a journalist, "Either the hills have Wi-Fi, or the ghost has better reception than us." The remark spread as a bitter inside joke. Ernesto was always a step ahead, even against machines. Many people still think that modern technology makes fugitives powerless, but Calabria showed otherwise. Loyalty and geography often outweighed gadgets. So what do you think? Is technology truly a net strong enough to catch a ghost? Or does it only make his legend larger with every failure? Historical fact again. In 2006, police discovered sophisticated underground bunkers in Calabria, complete with electricity, ventilation, and escape tunnels. Some were so advanced, they seemed like military installations. Investigators suspected Ernesto had used similar shelters, built beneath farms and houses, invisible to aerial scans. For Ernesto, the digital crackdown only sharpened his discipline. He trusted fewer people, moved less, and blended deeper into the routines of ordinary life. While drones circled above, he might be sitting quietly in a farmhouse kitchen, sipping black coffee, waiting for the noise to pass. The contrast between state-of-the-art surveillance and his monk-like existence deepened his myth. A man beating satellites with silence. By the late 2000s, the ghost was not only a fugitive from law, but a symbol of resistance against technology itself. For every wiretap that failed, for every drone that scanned empty valleys, his legend thickened. The world was modernizing, but Ernesto Fazzalari remained what he had always been, an old-world ghost moving through the hills, untouched by wires, unseen by eyes in the sky. Betrayal at the edges creeps into Ernesto Fazzalari's story as the 2010s approach. For 2 decades, silence has been his armor, but every fortress develops cracks. Associates are arrested, relatives questioned, allies pressured by prosecutors. The state offers reduced sentences and protection to those willing to talk. Though Calabria remains less porous than Sicily when it comes to informants, the pressure is relentless. Even the ghost must contend with the possibility that someone, somewhere, might trade silence for survival. Historical fact: Italy's anti-mafia strategy after the 1990s leaned heavily on pentiti, repentant mafiosi who testified against their former comrades. In Sicily, hundreds stepped forward after bloody wars decimated loyalty. In Calabria, the culture of omertà was harder to crack, but by the early 2000s, a handful of 'ndrangheta insiders began cooperating. Their testimonies shed light on hidden structures and fugitive networks. Each new witness risked unraveling webs that had endured for generations, information closest to character. Reports suggest Ernesto's circle shrank in these years. He trusted fewer messengers, cut ties with distant relatives, and relied only on those who had proven themselves across decades. Villagers whispered that he moved less often, choosing instead to deepen his invisibility. Associates described him as even more severe, a man who scrutinized every gesture, every pause in conversation, watching for hints of disloyalty. His paranoia was not dramatic. It was quiet, cold, a constant evaluation of whether silence could still be trusted. Humor, bitter though it was, sometimes colored these fears. After one associate was arrested and rumored to be speaking to prosecutors, a villager joked, "If Ernesto is a ghost, then the pentiti are the wind, blowing secrets whether you want them or not." The laughter was uneasy because the truth stung. Betrayal was now a real possibility. Many people still think that betrayal in the mafia comes suddenly, with dramatic confessions and broken oaths. But often it is slower, creeping in through fear, through exhaustion, through the promise of safety for one's family. So what do you think? Is betrayal a choice or an inevitability in a life where loyalty is tested endlessly? Historical fact again. In 2012, several major Calabrian figures began cooperating with authorities, exposing details about international drug routes and local clan wars. Prosecutors believed that even if Ernesto's name was not directly betrayed, the networks around him were being mapped more clearly. Each testimony narrowed the ghost's space to hide. For Ernesto, betrayal was not a sudden collapse, but a shifting tide. He had built his life on silence, but silence now carried cracks. Each rumor of a talkative associate, each arrest that led to cooperation, reminded him that his invisibility was fragile. He was still the ghost, but the air around him stirred with the whispers of those who might finally speak. And so, the late years of his fugitive life were haunted not only by helicopters and drones, but by something more insidious. The risk that silence, once absolute, could be broken from within. For a man who had built his legend on trust in the unspoken, betrayal at the edges was the most dangerous enemy of all. The 2016 Dawn raid is the moment when the ghost of Aspromonte is finally cornered. After 20 years of silence, survival, and myth, Ernesto Fazzalari wakes to a world closing in. For years, he has evaded raids, vanished into mountains, slipped past drones, and watched as police grew weary. But this time, the net is tighter, the intelligence sharper, the betrayal more precise. Historical fact. On June 26, 2016, at around 2 a.m., Ernesto Fazzalari was captured in Malocchio, a small village near his birthplace of Taurianova. He had been on the run since 1996, sentenced in absentia to life in prison for mafia murders. Italy's interior minister at the time hailed the arrest as a success for the state, calling Fazzalari the country's second most dangerous fugitive after Matteo Messina Denaro. The raid involved carabinieri units, helicopters, and months of surveillance, information closest to character. Investigators said Ernesto was found in a farmhouse where he had been living with a companion. He offered no resistance, no dramatic speech, no desperate flight into the hills. Instead, he was calm, subdued, almost resigned. After 2 decades of vanishing into fog, the ghost appeared in the most ordinary of places, caught not in a cave or a bunker, but in a bed. The irony was not lost on Torianova. Villagers, long used to whispering his name, now shook their heads. "So many years of chasing a ghost," one man muttered, "and they found him in a house like anyone else." The humor carried bitterness, but also awe, because until that dawn, many believed he would never be caught. Many people still think that fugitives fall only through betrayal. But Ernesto's arrest also showed the grinding persistence of law enforcement. Wiretaps, patient surveillance, and subtle pressure on his network slowly narrowed his world. So, what do you think? Was his capture the triumph of the state, or simply the moment when the ghost finally allowed himself to be seen? Historical fact again. Interior Minister Angelino Alfano called the arrest one of the most important operations of recent years, declaring it proof that the state always wins in the end. Yet some criminologists noted the irony. Ernesto had lived free for 20 years, shaping an empire in shadows. If the state won, it was by patience, not by force. For Ernesto, the Dawn Raid marks the end of freedom, but not the end of myth. Even in handcuffs, his silence continued. He said little, offered no confessions, displayed no panic. The same composure that carried him through caves and vendettas now accompanied him into custody. If he was the ghost of Aspromonte, then his capture was less an exorcism than a quiet unveiling. The hills that once hid him stood unchanged, still green, still silent. But their ghost was gone, brought down not by bullets or betrayal alone, but by the simple truth that no shadow can last forever. When the dawn finally breaks, prison walls and fading echoes now define the life of Ernesto Fazzalari. After 2 decades of vanishing into Calabria's rugged terrain, the ghost of Aspromonte finds himself confined to a cell. The silence he once commanded on mountain ridges is replaced by the clanging of bars and the shuffle of guards' boots. For the first time in years, he is visible every hour of every day, catalogued, contained, and surveilled by a state that once failed to hold him. Historical fact. Following his 2016 arrest, Ernesto was taken to a maximum security prison under the strict 41 bis regime. This system isolates mafia leaders from their networks, restricting visits, mail, and even conversations with fellow inmates. It was designed to sever the invisible strings bosses still pulled from behind bars. For a man who thrived on silence and invisibility, the state imposed a new, harsher silence, one enforced by steel and law. Information closest to character suggests he adjusted with the same composure he displayed in freedom. Guards described him as calm, polite, never prone to outbursts. He spoke little, requested little, and carried himself with the same air of quiet inevitability. One officer recalled, it was as though he had already rehearsed this ending. Yet, the legend did not vanish with the cell door's clang. In Torianova, villagers still whispered. Some said his capture meant the end of an era. Others insisted the ghost remained, haunting memories if not mountains. Children who once grew up hearing his name on news broadcasts now passed posters of him in newspapers, proof that the ghost had finally been caught. Still, even in defeat, his myth lingered. Humor sometimes softened the edges of his downfall. After his capture, a local remarked, "If they needed 20 years to find him, maybe they should hire him to train the police." Laughter rippled, half admiration, half relief, proof that even in chains, Ernesto's story carried a strange respect. Many people still think that prison erases power, that once behind bars, a mafia boss becomes irrelevant. But history shows otherwise. Incarceration often amplifies legends, turning men into symbols larger than their deeds. So what do you think? Did Ernesto's capture end his influence, or did it simply shift him from man to myth? Historical fact again, the Ndrangheta did not collapse after his arrest. Calabria's clans continued to thrive, their networks intact. Ernesto's imprisonment was a victory for the state, but it was also a reminder that removing one ghost does not banish the entire haunting. In his cell, Ernesto Fazzalari became what he had always threatened to be, a shadow preserved in memory, a story carried in whispers, a figure whose power lay not in presence, but in absence. The ghost of Aspromonte had been captured, but his echoes remained, fading, yet never fully gone. And now, with the ghost confined, our journey through Calabria's hills and shadows reaches its quiet close. The story of Ernesto Fazzalari, woven from whispers and silence, slows into stillness. Imagine the Aspromonte at dusk, mountains draped in violet mist, their ridges patient as ever. The wind drifts softly through chestnut trees, carrying the same hush that once concealed a fugitive. Those valleys, once filled with fear of his presence, now breathe only memory. Take a long breath here, letting the air feel cool and slow. The years of running, the endless manhunts, the raids at dawn, all of it fades now, like footprints washed away by mountain rain. The ghost is no longer pursued. He is contained, and the silence of the hills belongs only to themselves again. Close your eyes if you like, and picture those caves where fires once burned low, where men spoke in whispers, where legends grew larger than truth. Picture them now empty, the stone walls holding nothing but echoes. Even ghosts, it seems, eventually return to silence as you let the story settle. Let your mind drift with it. Every chapter of this tale has carried the weight of tension, of survival, of shadows moving unseen. But here at the end, there is only stillness, the slow rhythm of breathing, the gentle hum of night. You have walked through vendettas and mountains, through raids and betrayals, through shadows and silence, and now you can leave them behind, as the ghost himself has been left behind. All that remains is the calm, the quiet, the long exhale at the end of a haunting. Rest easy now. The story is finished. The ghost is gone. The night is yours.